Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to all. We have, after about 9 weeks ago, we had a talk by intersex activist Krishna on understanding intersex human rights in India. This talk was the result of the consequence of Gopi Krishna's work being recognized by the Madurai bench of the Madras High Court on 24th April 2019, where the Tamil Nadu government was told to order a ban on sex reassignment surgeries of intersex children. This was a very landmark thing, and I think that order of the government has also come. Now, at that talk, it became evident that persons who were in the audience did not really understand the diversity of differently gendered people, especially transgenders. So we are fortunate today to have a leading exponent of this very subject, Professor Raj Rao, to speak on transgender identities, marginalized within a marginalized community. Professor Rao is not to be confused with the great literary figure, late Professor K. Raja Rao, who lived in France and America. Professor Rao is a writer, poet, and teacher of literature and is widely acknowledged as one of the leading gay rights activists of our country. His novel, The Boyfriend, in 2003, is India's first gay novel. It is considered a yardstick for research in queer studies. Professor Rao is one of the first to offer a course on LGBT literature at university level in India, and in 2007, he began it after overcoming years of resistance from the academic community. This is not surprising. Although India has not had the rigidity of monotheistic traditions on this subject, some prudishness has crept in unnoticed, which people attribute to the colonial period, and that is probably correct. We may not put Oscar Wilde on trial, but hitherto, the professions where one could be gay without any kind of social persecution in India were journalism and the legal profession. People allowed you to be yourself. Very surprisingly, our academics have been the most puritanical when it comes to accepting gender diversity, and therefore this makes Professor Rao's success all the more laudable. Like many modern and progressive writers, Professor Rao has been extremely critical of the RSS and quick to pass judgment on them and their so-called narrow-mindedness. He has blamed them for the judiciary's delay in scrapping Section 377 and said that, I quote, "The climate for gays in India will only be more suffocating, unquote. Perhaps this thinking is because the gay movement unconsciously follows the left and its intellectual straitjackets rather than doing its own thinking. My friend, Ashok Rao Kavi, who lives in nearby Mumbai, did not suffer from these intellectual fashions. Coming to the RSS, in September 2018, the Sarsang Chalak, Mr. Mohan Bhagwat, Dr. Bhagwat, addressed a 3-day conclave in Delhi titled Future of Bharat and RSS Perspective. Here he specifically said that the RSS agrees with the Supreme Court that homosexuality is not a crime and that the LGBTQ community is a part of society. He added that people should not be made to feel isolated because of any orientation. As a journalist, I know it for a fact that this led to a profound backlash within the organization and huge criticism. This was obviously communicated to Dr. Bhagwat. So on October 1st, 2019, just a few days ago, at the release of Mr. Sunil Ambika's book, RSS, Roadmaps for the 21st Century, Dr. Bhagwat reiterated his position and mentioned the contribution of queers in history and in our Indian tradition, specifically their sacrifices in wars. As no other organization has taken such a firm and unequivocal stand on this subject, I think it deserves acknowledgement and appreciation from those who are supposed to be fighting for this cause. Anything less would not be academic honesty. I now ask Professor Rao to give his presentation. You may speak for half an hour. Thank you.
first time here at the Nehru Memorial, but it seems like I've been here. It seems familiar. Let me begin by, my focus is on trans identities. But let me begin by saying that to the heteronormative mainstream, even now, I think, using formulation like LGBTQIA, most people only stop at T and say LGBT, and they don't even know that there are other letters, QIA, and actually there's a plus sign after the A, which only indicates that, the non-heteronormative sexualities are not a monolith. I think that this is the first thing that heteronormative mainstream needs to know. And the old dichotomy of heterosexual / homosexual, I mean, that's pretty dated actually. So, we need to become aware of this. Incidentally, L stands for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender, Q for queer, I for intersex, A for asexual, and then the plus sign. There are many new and emerging sexualities: allosexual, demisexual, monosexual, polysexual, omnisexual, androsexual, gynosexual, scoliosexual, autosexual. Some may be variants of the larger lesbian and gay sexualities, but they are specific, and they mean specific things. Hindustan Times about a year ago, actually, what's her name, Pulomi Banerjee, she wrote this article, where she talked to some of us on the phone, and there are a whole lot of these different new emerging sexualities that are described. And young people, young students, I'm a professor and teach at the PG level, and I find that young students are aware of these terms, and someone would say that, for example, that they are polysexual, or someone else might say they are pansexual, and so on. So I think we need to be familiar with these terms. But my real concern here is to say that trans people today feel that lesbian, gay, bisexual mainstream is almost as hegemonic as the heteronormative mainstream. So this is why I call my talk, I call it, that they are doubly marginalized. They are marginalized because they are not heterosexual and heteronormative, but they are also marginalized on account of their gender. Now, in the old days, even in Judith Butler, you have expressions like gender identity crisis. That term changed about 2 years ago, and it's now referred to as gender dysphoria. And this essentially means that one's birth gender, the gender given to one at the time of one's birth, over which of course one has no agency at all, is in conflict with their perceived gender. So one gender, that is birth gender, is of course biological, but their perceived gender is how they see themselves. So that might be defined as psychological, but it is a real conflict. It is not an imagined conflict, it's a real conflict. And this is what makes them transgender people. Now, what about their sexuality? What about their sexual orientation? This is complicated because one would have thought that, if a boy thinks that he's a girl, then he must also be homosexual. And if a girl thinks that she's a boy or feels like a boy, in the old days you had expressions like tomboy and so on. But if a girl feels that she's really a boy, or a boy feels that he's really a girl, then they must also be homosexual. But it's not always like that, because there are trans people who are either bisexual or even heterosexual. So, it's complicated. This interface, what I'm really trying to get at is this interface of sexuality and gender within the LGBTQIA plus subculture, not in relation to the heteronormative mainstream, where this is much more easy to understand. But within the LGBT subculture, this interface of gender and sexuality is complicated, and therefore it needs to be understood. Trans people would say that they are oppressed. Now, of course, there are a large number of trans people. I've got examples who started out as homosexuals. There is the example of A. Revati, whose autobiography, Truth About Me, a Hijra Life Story, was translated from Tamil by V. Geeta. And there is the autobiography of Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi, whose autobiography, I'm proud to say, was co-translated by me and my co-translator from Marathi to English, Ms. Dr. P.G. Joshi. Now, both Revati and Lakshmi talk about their early lives. They were born males. The gender assigned to them, they wouldn't agree that they were born male, even though they had a penis and testicles, but they wouldn't agree that that in itself made them male. But they talk about being raised as boys, because that's how society saw them. And they talk about being attracted to other boys, right? So they were, of course, homosexual. But then they were different from other homosexuals. Now, this is the other confusion. Hoshang Merchant talks about it in his introduction to Yarana, Gay Writing from India, that for a lot of people, there is no distinction between the homosexual and the hijra. So a lot of the abusive terms for homosexual in Indian languages. In English, you would say faggot and pansy and so on. But in Indian languages, they are, I think that Koti is one of them, but there's a kind of, there's a kind of overlap. The terms of abuse used for hijras and homosexuals, both could be called chakka, both could be called number 6, and so on. So that confusion certainly arises. Now, I think that this is what people like Ashok Rao Kavi and others have been emphasizing, that all homosexual men are not, and women are not trans. So I have to say over here that I am exclusively homosexual, but not trans. I mean, I've never felt that, I've never suffered from gender dysphoria, right? Whereas with Lakshmi and Revati, there was an early instance of this gender dysphoria that impelled them to transition. And I must say over here that all trans people don't transition. The word koti that Kuhu just used is, let's say effeminate men who are really trans, whose identities are trans, but then they don't transition. They continue to live with the conflict. And it is a conflict because, their biological gender and their psychological perception of themselves is in conflict. A lot of them end up having dual lives, a sort of schizophrenia, I would call it, because throughout their life, they're leading a double life. Because they are seen as guys, their families insist that they get married to women, but then they often have a nightlife, with people of their own gender. Now, in our book, Whistling in the Dark, 21 Queer Interviews, published in 2009 by Sage, Um, I was the main, the interviewer, because it's a series of 21 interviews with people across the spectrum, including people from, the working class, masseurs and auto drivers and so on, as well as highly educated people. And I co-edited it with a former student of mine, Divya Jyoti Sharma, who now lives in Delhi, actually. And here we have interviews with people who say that they've lived this sort of double life. This is unbelievable to a lot of us throughout their lives. I mean, they are in their 40s and 50s now, but they say that they've devised ways of leading this double life so that even their, the heteronormative side is the official side and the respectable side of their lives, about which their families and their employers and their neighbors and their relations would know. But then there is the subversive side to their lives, which only their homosexual partners would know, right? So you can imagine the stressfulness of having to live that kind of schizophrenic existence throughout their life. But I think that for a lot of Kotis, this is the reality. Also, I might say over here, again, it's incorrect to generalize, but usually, socio-economically, Kotis are not from the upper strata of society, but from the, let's say, lower middle class or poor, so they would say that we can't be gay because the Western idea of gay is that you're out of the closet, right? I was at the Pune Literature Festival in a panel, and we had this guy, and everybody was really quite. I won't name him, but everybody was quite. What's the word? Quite put off by what he said, because he was the first speaker, and he says, I'm privileged. I never suffered any discrimination. My family accepted me. I'm from the upper crust, and it's all right. So everyone wanted to say to him, but this is not just about you. It's about others, and it's fine that you're privileged. And then he went on to say that he has not done any reading, and so he was basically living in a very insular sort of world. And I don't think he really made any valuable interventions. At the end, he said, he actually ended by saying, I've never felt so foolish because I'm not aware of any of these intellectual ideas. I know that I was okay, my parents accepted me, and I can bring my lovers, my same-sex lovers home, and so on. But it's not just that, So there is certainly a class differential. Kotis, the word you mentioned, these trans people who don't transition but who continue to remain with the conflict, have a big problem with westernized gay men, like this guy I was talking about, because they would say that you are privileged if you can come out of the closet and be accepted by your families and so on, which is not the case with us, we will be discriminated against, we will be thrown out of the house and so on. Actually, a lot of hijras are forced to become hijras. I think you need to understand that especially, if you compare these two autobiographies, Revati's is a little different from Lakshmi's. Lakshmi was lucky because, again, she says that her parents eventually accepted her. It's not that they were okay with her right from the start. And there is this section in the book where, they see on television, she was in South Bombay attending rallies and so on, and attending these hijra gharanas, and they live in Thana, which is about 50 kilometers away, and they saw on television that she had decided to become a hijra. And she talks about how her brother rushed to the train station and told her, hold on, don't go home because there'll be a big hangama if you go home at this point. Eventually, her father was interviewed and so on, and one of the things he said, when they asked Lakshmi's father, how is it that you accepted her? Didn't you sort of think that she had shamed you and so on? His answer was that, if I don't accept her, what kind of life will she have? She will be reduced to begging on the streets and doing sex work, which is exactly what a lot of hijras do even today. In spite of all the various transgender rights bills right from 2014 that have that were introduced by the government, beginning with the Nalsa judgment bill, transgender bill, down to the present, there's a lot of hypocrisy. You mentioned it, but there's a lot of double standards in these various transgender rights bills, because I don't think that the majority of trans people have really benefited from this. One of the biggest issues here, I'll come to that, is about self-identification of gender. So in 2014, they agreed that trans people could declare on their own that they are transgender. But later on, that was diluted, and they asked for proof. They wanted doctors to, and that were government doctors, to give a certificate to say that, that the person is transgender. And that, of course, would depend on whether they are post-surgery or pre-surgery. Between these two, Revati is post-surgery, but Lakshmi is not. She's pre-surgery. She hasn't had her operation, which in the hijras they don't call it sex change operation. They call it their nirvana. It's basically a castration rite, which if you read a book like Age Sutra, Salman Rushdie interviews Lakshmi, but, he puts it in... you see, it's so insensitively put, because he describes the operation, which he's actually quoting from some other source, some American writer who's written a passage on how the hijras have their castration rite without an anesthetic and so on. And then he describes it in graphic detail, because Rushdie is very good at doing that. And then he ends by saying, ouch, and that is so insensitive, right? Because the process for them is excruciatingly painful. Revati describes it, how she has this surgery. In her case, it's not even the traditional way in which it's supposed to be done. They do go to a clinic, but they are in great pain, and they are traveling back from Chennai to Bombay in this second-class compartment, and she and another hijra, and they are in great pain and so on. So, for that reason, and also for other reasons, the other reason being that since for many hijras, sex work is the main source of livelihood. The other thing that they do is, what's called badhai. That is to say, they give blessings to newly married couples and when children are born and so on. But that doesn't earn them anything. And then it's called mangti, which is to say that they go to shops and collect some money. Or they beg at traffic signals and so on. And you know how we treat them. But a more lucrative source of income for many of them is sex work. But again, sex work is not easy. In Bangalore, there was the case of Familia who was they're brutalized by the police. They are in competition with female sex workers who don't like them because they think that they are taking away their clients and their customers. The police understand female prostitution, but they don't understand trans prostitution, hijra prostitution, so they can be very brutal with them. So it's... there's no light at the end of the very dark tunnel. But it's for this reason that many of them delay their transition. I'm talking about the hijras, who would say that they would have it at a later stage and not as soon as they join a hijra gharana and become hijras. So these are things, of course, that gay and lesbian people don't have to go through, because you don't suffer from gender dysphoria. And of course there's other forms of oppression which we all know, but at least, it's not sort of duplicated on account of what I might call, or what is called gender dysphoria. Now, is the trans community itself a monolith? And again the answer is no. Today when you use the word transgender, most of us know and think of trans women. Very few people know that there's also the reverse kind of transgender identity of women, who are assigned the feminine gender at birth, but who suffer from gender dysphoria, and suffer is the wrong word, but who think that birth gender given to them at the time of birth is not their real gender, and they want to transition and become men. And then when they do so, of course, they would be called trans men, just as men who transition and become women are called trans women. So you can already see that within trans identities you have three different subcategories. You have transgender people who have not transitioned. Then you have even more than three. Then you have trans women, and again that can be further divided into pre-operative and post-operative. And then you have trans men, who can again be divided into pre-operative and post-operative. So it's actually 5 different subcategories. So you can see how complicated this gets, So as the newspapers, loosely LGBT, as is bandied about, is really far from the truth. The truth is that there are many variations to this. Now, there are gay people who have a problem with the desire of trans people to transition. And the objection there would be, you can take me up on this, because this is my own feeling also, but there are others. In Delhi there's she's not here, but she's quoted in a book. Rituparna Bora is quoted in a book as a well-known queer theorist and queer activist who has this difficulty with trans people. And the difficulty is that to one way of thinking, transitioning and changing one's gender is a roundabout way of returning to heterosexuality, right? Because once a person transitions, right, it doesn't end with that. The person who has transitioned desires to have a full-fledged sexual and romantic relationship, even a marital one, with cis men or women, as the case may be, right? So, in the very first case of a sex change operation in Bombay, this was in the 80s, someone called Farokh Rustam, who had a sex change operation and became Farah Rustam. So a guy becomes a woman and then finds a lover, a German lover in this case, and gets married to him and even wants to have children with him, which she realized at a much later stage that would not be possible, because although her gender had been changed, but a womb couldn't be transplanted into her body that would make it possible for her to have a child. And then there was the other famous case of Adi Banerjee, who transitioned and became Ida Banerjee. And Riyaz Wadia, who made Bombay based on my poems, also made a documentary called A Mermaid Called Ida in 1996, which is because Riyaz passed away prematurely, his films are not easily available, but he made this documentary. And Ida Banerjee again, these were not hijras. So I must also make this very clear that all trans women are not hijras. Hijras are a group of trans women, but there are other trans women who can become trans women through surgical intervention without joining hijra gharanas. And again, there would be a class differential here, because those who actually become hijras would generally be from the lower strata of society, whereas those who independently have a sex change operation would be from the upper strata of society, as indeed Farooq Rustam and Adi Banerjee were. But both of them wanted to be full-fledged women, to the point where they wanted to conceive, and deliver babies and so on, which of course did not happen in their case. The reverse is also true, and I distinctly remember that about 10 years ago, Time magazine had a cover story about a man who had finally given birth to a baby. But this was, again, not a cis man. This was a trans man who had transitioned, but his womb or her womb was retained, and this is how she could give birth to a baby. She is the pronoun, of course, that would have been used before she transitioned. After transitioning, she would want to be called he and not she. But the cover story was about a man giving birth to a baby. This was mischievous, I would say, on the part of Time magazine, because when you read the cover story, of course, you realize that this was not a cis man, but a trans man. If cis men could really give birth to babies, I think that all religions would have to retract their view that homosexuality is unnatural, because this basically comes from religion across the board. No one religion, all the major religions and minor religions deride homosexuality for precisely this reason and call it unnatural, because it doesn't lead to reproduction. So they see human sexuality, as a means only to procreation, which of course people have disputed. People from the LGBTQIA subculture have disputed. For example, there's one LGBTQIA plus person who says that if sex was only for, this is a very pertinent question, that if sex was only for, if sex was not for recreation, why do we use condoms? Right? And you have to think about this, that why this insistence on condoms if sex is not for recreation? Or why is a product like the condom even made if sex is not also for recreation? Which is to say that if it's only for procreation and you want to procreate, then you have sex, and you don't want to procreate, you don't have sex. But people obviously don't only have sex when they want to procreate. So sex is also for recreation, and therefore you need the condom, and so on. But religions are unwilling to accept this point of view, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or any other religion, major or minor. And therefore, my feeling is that the day cis men are able to have children, I don't know whether, I'm not a medical person, so I don't know whether scientists are working in that direction, but the day they're able to do this, believe me, religions will have to retract their earlier view that homosexuality is unnatural. Now, so I just made this point that there is a kind of friction between gay people by which I mean lesbian, gay, both. You need to understand this also, that lesbian is gender specific, gay is not gender specific, it's gender neutral. A woman can be called gay, but a man can't be called a lesbian. So although when you use the term gay, you think of men, but a woman can be called gay. Likewise with the word homosexual. The word homosexual is not gender specific, it's gender neutral. A woman can be called a homosexual, a woman can be called gay, but lesbian is a gender specific term that applies to women who are sexually attracted to other women. So this friction between gay men and women and trans people is sometimes on account of the fact that for us, and you can quiz me on this because I too am of that view that trans then becomes a roundabout way of returning to heterosexuality, whereas the fight should be against the resistance. Let me not use the word fight, but the resistance should be against heterosexuality and heteronormativity. But if we return to it, then you can't resist it at the same time. So I hope I'm making myself clear that you're either a resisting voice or then you're co-opted. So through a change of gender, one is really effecting this sort of co-optation. There are also some trans people who go, I don't know how well this is researched, but they go to the extent of saying that in certain religions, there was this Muslim trans man who says, who is quoted in a book, I'll talk about this book in a minute, but he's quoted in this book as saying that in Islam, homosexuality is haram, but Islam permits one to change one's gender. Now, whether I'm not an Islamic scholar and whether this is true or not, I'm in no position to say, but this is what some trans people also feel, that it's a way, transitioning then is a way of reducing let's say the perversion, the sinfulness, any of these terms can be used, that applies to gay people, right? Because if you're gay, your sexuality is perverse. So queer, right? A man having sex with another man, a woman having sex with another woman is queer. And this becomes then a way of reducing the queerness. Though, of course, trans people can never be the same as cis people, and that's again the conflict. There are feminists who dissociate themselves from trans women. Cis women feminists who dissociate themselves from trans women because they say that being born male and then transitioning is not the same thing as being female from the time of birth and, suffering the sort of discrimination that women suffer is different from being born male and enjoying those privileges of being male up to a certain point and then only transitioning later. So you can see that there's no agreement here even between cis women. Cis women are not willing to accept trans women. Likewise, cis heterosexual women are not willing to accept lesbians. So even within gender, you see the number of categories that you have. When Ashwini Suktankar edited this very important book called Facing the Mirror, Lesbian Writing from India in 1998 or 1999, which Penguin brought out, on the very first page, she talks about how when Deepa Mehta's film Fire, which is, of course, a lesbian story if you've seen Fire, was released the previous year. And in Bombay, the Shiv Sena vandalized the cinemas that showed the film and wanted it to be banned, Mr. Bal Thackeray actually had the temerity to say that I'll allow it to play in the cinemas if you change the names of these two women, these two sisters-in-law from Radha and Sita, and give them Muslim names. One of the actresses was Shabana Azmi, who's already Muslim, but the other was Nandita Das. So he said, why don't you call them Shabana and Rehana or something, and then I'll let the film play. My boys, Bal Thackeray always talked about his boys who were basically Bombay's thugs. I'm a Bombay boy, so I know. Now, that's not the real story that I'm trying to tell you. The story is that in Delhi, women's groups organized maybe a Jantar Mantar where all these protests happen, a counter sort of protest against the vandalism of the Shiv Sena. And they said that you must let this film play because it's about women. Ashwini Suktankar says in the opening page of her book that when this protest march was organized at Jantar Mantar or wherever, a group of lesbians went there. They were a small group and they went there with their own placard or banner or whatever which proclaimed their sexuality, and they said, we are proud to be lesbian. Indian and lesbian. Yes. And they were immediately told off by the media and also by many of the straight women in that protest march who actually used the word hijacked and said that you're hijacking the protest because, first of all, they said, and I think they got their cue from director Deepa Mehta herself. I think she should be rapped for saying this, but she said that Fire is not a lesbian film. And then she, there was specious reasoning on her part that it's not a lesbian film, this is situational lesbianism, and they become lesbians because their husbands don't sleep with them and so on, which are very flimsy arguments, right? But this is what happened. Now, I'm trying to show you that you take any of these categories and you see that there is no, there's a lot of friction, right? So you take trans and you have subcategories. I'll just come to that. Trans men and trans women can't see eye to eye. But here I'm talking about lesbians and trans people, cis women and trans women, right? Or even cis men and trans men, even there would be an inability to see eye to eye and so on. So that is there. Now, the reason I thought of giving this talk is that I think last year a book was published by Penguin Random House, and this was called Invisible Men Inside India's Trans-Masculine Network. The author, Nandini Krishnan, identifies as a cis woman. It's a fat book which she and I were co-panelists at the Kala Ghoda festival in January or February in Bombay, and she gave me a signed copy. I didn't read it for a long time because there were other things I was busy with, but then I started reading it and finished the whole book, and then wrote to Mr. A.J. Thomas, who was the editor of Indian Literature, that I would like to review it, which he agreed, and the review has been accepted, but it hasn't appeared. Now, this was an eye-opener to me, because in this book, which is entirely about trans masculinity, she talks about women who transition and become men, right? And how difficult it is for them. In every which way, it seemed as if the whole world is against them. Now, the interesting thing is that Nandini Krishnan meant well when she wrote this book. But immediately there were protests, the book was burned, and trans women, they actually, as a Kala Ghoda, Kalagoda events are held late in the evening because it's in the open. And it was 10 o'clock at night, ours was the last panel. You know, they came in a big group, I won't use the word mob, and they were ready to, beat us all up because they said their argument, then one of them was allowed to go, they should have been on the panel actually, but none of them was invited to be on the panel. But finally, the organizers gave one of them the mic and said that, okay, you make your speech and you say what you want to say. And she basically said, this was a trans man who had transitioned. So the first thing is that she was an object of everybody's gaze, not just the male gaze, female gaze, whatever gaze, because everybody, nobody's, trans women we've seen heteros, but trans men, we've hardly seen them. So everybody was first looking at her, a woman who has become a man, and I'm sure they were thinking, does she have a penis, and how do they attach a penis to her body, and so on. But she basically said that our lives are already fraught with difficulty, and in writing this book, Nandini Krishnan, as a cis woman, has done us a disservice because she's misrepresented our lives. This was their argument, that we don't think that she meant well. It's a fat book, and I'll tell you why it's a fat book, but their point of view was that we don't think that she had a right to write this book. Although she claims in the book, and that's evident from the book, and that's why it's like a PhD thesis actually, that she did travel across the length and breadth of India. She went to far out places like the Northeast and so on to meet trans men, stay with them, understand their lives, and then tell their stories. But in spite of this, the trans masculine community was not happy because they said that their lives had been misrepresented, and it was only they who were in a position to tell their stories and nobody else, right? And what was a cis woman of all people doing, telling their stories? And you can see, of course, you can see the tensions over here, the tensions in terms of privilege, because a cis woman has no gender dysphoria. Nandini Krishnan is very, very articulate, very attractive. So there's no gender dysphoria, right? And here is that kind of, and she's highly accomplished. She's been to England and she's been to America, and Penguin has published her book and so on. So every which way you look at it, she is privileged. And now she decides to, depict the lives of these women who basically would be seen as freaks. I think that you must understand that trans people, why trans people? Gay men, lesbians, bisexuals, everybody from the LGBTQIA plus community is seen by the heteronormative mainstream as freaks, as perverse. That's why all these terms of abuse exist. Even now, the decriminalization, if you ask me, has really not done much. That's another debate that we can have, which I will not go into. But it has not really done much because mindsets take a long time to change. There are many people, even educated people, who don't even know that, first of all, that there was a law that decriminalized homosexuality, and second, that the law has been read down by the Supreme Court. They don't even know that. It doesn't concern them, and they don't know that. But also because of, now I have to say a few political things, but because of who's ruling us and their attitudes to homosexuality, which I have, of course, been very vocal about, that this was a legislative and not, a judicial and not a legislative decision. The first time round, the Supreme Court put the onus on the government and said that the government should amend the law if it wanted. This was Justice Singhvi. The government didn't do anything. Why did we have to ask for a curative petition? The government should have, at that point, and Mr. Arun Jaitley actually said that, the government should do something. He meant well, but then he died, poor guy. But the government didn't do anything. Again, it was left to the court. Why should we have even had to file a curative petition? When the judge clearly said that it's for the government to decide on this, the government should have acted on it. And you know that Shashi Tharoor twice tried to introduce a private member bill in the Lok Sabha. Nothing happened. I'm not saying that his party, the Congress, is any better because even they did nothing. All of them, are of the same ilk. This party or that party, left or right or center or whatever. Finally, the court had to do it. And some of them have the temerity. One of them in the BJP has the temerity to suggest that court decisions are not final and binding. All you need is a larger bench. So a 5-judge bench overrules the ruling of a 2-judge bench. He said this. Subramaniam Swamy openly said this. He said all we need is a 7-judge bench to again say that homosexuality is illegal and so on. He said this. Many of you have not seen this on TV, but those of us who are following this have heard him say this and have heard him saying many other silly things. He said now there will be a proliferation of gay bars. So he was just trivializing the whole thing. And my biggest, let's say, the thing that wounds me, we were not congratulated. We would have liked Mr. Modi to congratulate us, and say that congratulations on your victory. They were just silent. And I think their silence spoke for itself, that they were not happy, but they had no option at that point, right, but to go by the judgment of the 5-judge constitutional bench of the Supreme Court and so on. So that's my view. Others may not agree. But the point I'm trying to make is that across the board, LGBT means perversion, freakishness and so on. So this is what the trans men were objecting to as far as Nandini Krishnan's book was concerned, because she identifies as a straight cis woman. I think in her whole book, I wanted to bring it in the last minute, I removed it because I thought there'll be excess baggage. It's that fat. Just to show you, but at the last minute I said, no, I'll just talk about it. But as a cis woman, the maximum she says in her book is that, well, when I was a child, I was a tomboy. But that's about it. She doesn't say that she's had same-sex encounters or relationships or anything. I think she refers somewhere to her boyfriend or partner or whatever. So, of course, this is really voice appropriation that angers any margin. It's like a Brahmin writing today about a Dalit, right? Mulk Raj Anand wrote Untouchable in 1935. Today, would someone like Mulk Raj Anand dare to write about Dalit lives? No. So I think one needs to understand this business of identity politics, who speaks on behalf of whom. This was the issue. Now the final point I make is, how do you write a book like this? The reason why, Nandini Krishnan quotes this trans man not from India, Guy Iman Semlar, a transgender activist, and he says, this is something to be considered. He says that when mainstream people attempt to write the stories of marginalized people, right, and he identifies these mainstream people as outsiders who are trying to write about the lives of insiders, he says there is an epistemic violence. This is his phrase, that there is an epistemic violence in the very act of writing. And then he says that the only way in which you should do this is to actually let these people, they can't write, they are not literate, all of them. Some of them may be, but most of them are not, and so they can't write. So then how do you get their stories across to the mainstream? And he says the only way to do this is almost like, putting a tape recorder there, pressing it, let them speak, and then just with minimal editing, publish it as it is. He says this is the only way in which you can tell the stories of trans people. This is the reason why Nandini's book is so fat, because she does that. And I had to say in my review that for this reason it's repetitive. It seems like it's badly edited, because my publisher, Paul, is here, and I think that all my publishers would insist that there has to be fine-tuned editing in a book before it's out. Now, this is exactly the dilemma that we suffered when we did this. When we did Me Hijra, Me Lakshmi, first of all, Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi is not Marathi speaking, nor is she a writer. She's from Uttar Pradesh. She has been to college, but she does not write. I'm not saying she cannot write, but she doesn't write. So what she did was she didn't, this was not her decision. There was a Marathi journalist in Bombay, Vaishali Rode, who met her, right, and said that why not we publish a book about you? And Lakshmi agreed, and the way they did it is that they had these sittings in one of their houses or in a cafe or somewhere where Vaishali Rode did exactly this. She sort of put the tape recorder on and Lakshmi, if you meet her, if you've seen her on television, she rambles. She's very sort of garrulous and she rambles. She says one thing and then goes to something else. We were at the Shillong Literature Festival, she and I and Wendell Rodrigues and Jerry Pinto, and Wendell Rodrigues lost his cool, because she just hogged the mic and anything that anyone asked, she would go there and answer, and we were all sort of overshadowed. But that's her personality. Now, when Vaishali Rode does the book and just switches the tape recorder on, this is how, the book finally is written. There's very little intervention on her part, right? There's no narrative backbone or anything. So when we decided to translate it, and we approached Oxford University Press, Rekha Natarajan at that time was with OUP, she's a friend of mine, and they agreed. The way we did it is that P.G. Joshi, my co-translator, I said, you do in English, you take Vaishali Rode's book, and you do a literal translation into English of what that book is, and then you give it to me. Now he did that, and when the manuscript came to me, I was shocked because it was so repetitive. It was not structured. There was no sense of, chapterization or anything. It was all over the place. And I said that my training being that of a writer and a literature professor and so on, we have to do a lot of editing. So it's not just about translation from Marathi to English, but a lot of restructuring, editing, dramatizing. And that is what I did, and submitted the manuscript to OUP, and this is what they brought out. Now, when Ashok Rao Kavi reviewed it in the Hindustan Times, he caught this, and it was a long review, and he basically says, this is not Lakshmi's book. This is Raj Rao's book. That made Lakshmi very upset, and it's not something that I should be proud about and happy about, because some of my students from DU, who were doing their MPhil, they did their MAs here and then they came to Pune to do their MPhil. One in particular, this a girl called Aparna Singh, she had these major arguments with me, and she said that, don't you see that you may be proud of this and it's a big publisher and it's gone all over the world because OUP brought it out, but don't you see that you appropriated her voice? And you've spoken on behalf of her because you come from a platform of privilege. You may be, Lakshmi says somewhere that she gave me the permission to do it because she says you are one of us. If you take LGBTQIA as a single group, then of course I'm one of them. I'm not as much of their other as someone like Nandini Krishnan would be as a cis woman who identifies as heterosexual. So I may be a cis man, but I don't identify as heterosexual. So to that extent, she says, okay, you're one of us. But there are other ways in which I'm not one of them because, my education and all that has been completely different. I've gone abroad and South Bombay, Sobo, and, so in a way, that was an imposition. Lakshmi could have protested against this the way the trans men protested against Nandini Krishnan's book. If she didn't do it, I think it's her magnanimity but she was very upset with Ashok Rao Kavi's review. She even wanted to take him to court and so on. I had no hand in that review because, but when it came out, I suddenly saw things in a way that that was my blind spot, and I wasn't able to see it at the time that we were doing the translation. I thought I was making it a better book, but I didn't realize that in making it a better book, I was also robbing Lakshmi of her voice, right? For example, I'll give you one example. She says somewhere that Salman Khan met her because he was doing a TV show called Das Ka Dam, and he wanted her on that show. So she says that randomly, she sort of refers to it. And then somewhere else she says, Salman Rushdie met me at Thana because he was doing this interview for AIDS phobia. Now, I caught on that and I said that, okay, let me sort of dramatize this. And I say somewhere in the book that Lakshmi must be the only person in the world to have been interviewed or spoken to on the phone by two Salmans extremely different from each other, Salman Khan and Salman Rushdie, one representing popular culture at its worst and the other representing high culture at its best. But this is not how she saw it, this is not what she said, this is not what Vaishali Rode said, this is what I say to give the book a kind of dramatic appeal. But in terms of voice appropriation, that can be held against me. So I'll stop there. I hope that I've given you enough fodder for thought and that we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very enlightening, I'm sure. Regarding your panelist at the Lit Fest who said he was from privileged background, I think he must have been an exceptionally lucky person, or he was not telling the truth, because in India we had this prince from the Kota royal family who was ostracized at one time, and then the family took its time, but they accepted him back, and now he is a leading activist for gay people who are coming out. It's not that easy to, about your thing about voice appropriation. It's easy to accuse somebody, but if you are telling the story of somebody, and we are all researchers here, most of us, we are taking up somebody's story and we are researching and giving it the best with our integrity. So tomorrow somebody, I'm doing Balochistan here, tomorrow somebody can't come and say that, who are you to speak? That is ridiculous. I think as academics we would find that attitude a little odd, because the men she has interviewed, Nandini, they all knew what she was doing. She put the microphone in front of them, they gave her their voices.
No, but one of the things, I didn't say this, one of the things that she also says, she says that, here she's talking as a cis woman, she says that trans men, I think this is what irked them the most. She says that they become men with a vengeance. So all the undesirable aspects of masculinity, which is patriarchy, misogyny, sexism, they sort of imbibe these and project these in a way that even cis men wouldn't do. I think this is what really pissed them off. She says, for example, she also stereotypes them. She says these trans men never wanted to go into the kitchen to make a cup of tea, but they wanted to drive heavy trucks and so on, just to prove that they were really masculine. But Sandhya, before I forget, let me say that, I think that this is a problem with academic research as well. We guys who are researchers and have done our PhDs and so on are accused for exactly this reason, that you're really parasiting on the stories and lives of marginalized people for your bread and butter or whatever, or for your own glory, for your own fame. You get your doctor's degree and so on. But this is not the right way. And I think that grassroots activists have this big issue with academic researchers like most of the fellows here, and indeed all of us. I mean, I did my PhD long ago in 1986. But all of us then are in that category who who would be disliked intensely by grassroots activists for this reason?
I will open the floor for discussion, but I just wanted to make two points regarding Islam being open to this community. I am not aware of it. Recently, we are aware there's alleged to be a tradition of what Tariq Fateh calls bachabazi in some parts of their community, in some parts of the world. There are known instances of Islamic State activists picking up so-called people of one group and throwing them off the roof publicly. This is something that has horrified the people. It does exist. There is another aspect of people who had their own voice. I therefore thought I should mention it. The popular writer James Morris, who later became Jan Morris and wrote about his own story in the work Conundrum, where he says that when he realized who he was and he had decided therefore to do something about it, that time he was already married. So he and his wife, they went ahead and had 4 children, I think, because the book I read long ago, and then he went for this. I think it would have created a stir. This kind of transition will create a stir in your life anyway. I would like now other people.
In the West, literacy levels are higher. So to cite a Westerner in the context of what we are talking might be a little off the mark, because here literacy levels are abysmally low. And this is what creates for the class differential. Yes.
Professor Rao, first of all, thank you for a very interesting and informative lecture. Thank you very much for that. My question is, you mentioned in your talk regarding Kothis, most of them being from the lower economic strata. And you also mentioned that some of the government bills which have been... My question is, these government bills, are they economically useful enough for the, the current Indian citizens who are transgenders? Maybe not, but I would like to know your view on this. That's all. Thank you.
When the first Nalsa judgment, based on the Nalsa judgment, the first 2014 transgender rights bill came out, it seemed as if it was beneficial to them, because they talked about quotas in government jobs and so on. But most importantly, they permitted self-identification of gender. So that Lakshmi says, for example, that when she went to apply for a passport, she did not want to say that her gender was male, right? Because by then she had become a hijra, but she was pre-operative and not post-operative. So if they carried out a medical examination, they would say that you're not a hijra. But that didn't happen, and they allowed her to be called neither male, third, or O, which stands for other. But later on, from 2014 up until the present, and this is the time the BJP comes to power, you see, that was heavily diluted, and there were contradictory judgments. So that in Nandini Krishnan's book, she cites the example of several people, trans people, who had to run from pillar to post and even resort to corruption and bribery and so on just to get this certificate from a government-recognized hospital or doctor to say that they suffer from gender dysphoria. So self-identification of gender is no longer accepted. I think that this is one of their biggest bones of contention, that why should we not be in a position to to say that we are trans people. Why does somebody else have to give us a certificate to say? And then she also talks about how insensitive doctors can be. There are cases for doctors, you'll be shocked that for a lot of doctors this becomes a pretext for voyeurism, because obviously you have to strip and, expose your bodies to them and so on, and it's a kind of voyeurism that titillates these doctors, especially in smaller towns.
To your question, since you have talked about that whether it is useful or not, the biggest part is that they have given reservation under other backward category, right? Yeah. And now this is a very hugely problematic because if you look at it, 1871 CTA, that is a Criminal Tribes Act, Hijras were considered a criminal tribe, that has been later abolished. Now you are going back again and treating them, though you are see, it's a one step forward, two step backward, because on the one hand you are giving them reservation, but you are giving them reservation again in the bracket of the caste, right? So again, you are treating them as a caste. The moment the caste connotations will come, it will be because there is a cultural memory, right? It is wittingly or unwittingly is going to associate them with the criminal tribes. Whether it is, of course, it's not legally there. So I think that was also quite insensitive in one way. But then, what was the way? Can we do them into the this PH category, physical handicap? We can't do even there, right? So I think there has to be a new modes of naming the reservation and putting in a different category needs to be there. So I think if you look at it, there are a lot of backhand and backlash in this.
You know, everywhere, whether you include them in backward castes or in physically handicapped, backward classes, yeah, or physically handicapped, but everywhere the problem of cis and trans will also come in. Even a physically disabled person or differently abled person who is cis and straight will feel superior, believe me, to a trans person who may be able-bodied but who's trans, because I think that sexual difference is treated, you know, very differently from any other kind of difference. Other kinds of difference are, you know, people are more sensitized, right? And there's a willingness to accept and empathize. But with sexual dissenters, absolutely not. Absolutely not. You know, I'm talking to you. Believe me, Sandhya. You know, what would you say about this? There are people who say, "Oh, but you don't look gay." Right now, what does that imply? People say this without even realizing, you know, the implications of what they are saying.
Sorry to interrupt. Just actually, you are just related to what you're saying. 2 years ago, there was an article. There was a video on NDTV actually. Some transgenders from Madhya Pradesh. Now they just went to, I think, some local government office, and they had to just that. It's part of the formality, just tick the box, male or female, and they actually, now, whether the transgenders, whatever they were, for example, they tick female. Then this clerk who was, but, you know, I'm confused, how can I, you know, confirm, blah, blah. So these problematic issues are there, so I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, clerks and all that, I mean, it becomes a source of hilarity for them. Now, even in Kaun Banega Crorepati, if you heard Amitabh Bachchan saying, "Agar aap purush hai to M, agar aap mahila hai to F, agar aap anya hai," he brings himself to say that. A lot of these people, believe me, can't use the gay word. Even today, 2019, they can't use the word hijra. They can't utter these words. For Amitabh Bachchan to say, "Agar aap anya hai," you know, I was very interested in his expression as he said this. But he says it. He has to say this. The channel must have told him that you have to say this. But there it's okay. But when you say a train reservation form still doesn't have a third box. Passport, I don't know, maybe. But it needs a certificate. So you can't just tick randomly any box you want. If you tick other, then you need to back it up with evidence.
Any more questions? I think one thing that we have to face over here on this self-certification business, I think the backlash came from the sports community worldwide because of disparity on issues relating to hormone production and things like that. So we should give the government a pass on that. What we should do among the literate people of your varied, diverse community is to prepare your own model bill. Because some of my friends say that there is a problem with the new bill which the government, this thing, and they said that when they went to the ministry, they were told that so-and-so expert of this place, he has written the bill virtually, and we don't know anything, we can't touch it. So this is another ring view which I had because a friend of mine told me this, who is from this diverse community. So these things are going to come up in our way, and they will change also. It is a matter of time. Yeah.
This is more of an observation rather than the question. We were talking about the coalition politics, as you have talked about that, how within the feminist groups there is a huge protest against feminism. In Maya Sharma's book, when she has quoted 2008 Calorie Report, this was very visible. Now, my point is that whenever we talk about the oppression within the oppressed group, there's always, as Weeks has also talked about, the vector triaggression, where the other coalition, that you form coalition with the other groups. Like, so my point is that there are works like about the trans feminism, where the feminists, they are not supporting lesbians. Now they are there, but still there is a fraction, right? But there are enough groups which are there, like Ami Koyama talked about it, the trans feminism where women and hijras, they come together to empower each other. And I like to give an example of Mahesh Dattani's 7 Steps Around the Fire, where the anarkali and the woman, they come together in order to fight patriarchy. One example also I would like to give from it just came to me from the street. We talk about the appropriation of public spaces, how the public spaces are not appropriated by women. Now, when we see a mimetic appropriation of a feminine corporeal cell by a hijra, who is a trans woman, let's put it that way, by a hijra on a road, and she is having a sexually suggestive behavior, non-normative behavior, and also appropriating a street space in a very, very feminine corporeal cell. So to my mind, it creates a fracture into the repressive module of feminine sexuality, which has to go on the sexual dieting after mid-age. And these women, these trans women, when they are appropriating streets in that fashion, so I think if one is marginalized in one community, one can always find a way for the coalition politics, but definitely it will create fractures for the larger umbrella of LGBTQ community. That is also understandable. So I think there is a way of coalition against these kind of patriarchal oppression within, outside the LGBTQ community as well. And we have literary representations and also widely Ami Koyama and all that. We have talked about trans feminism.
You know, I want to just go in response to what you say about hijras sort of taking over the streets, right? But see how they do it. If it's sex work, it's only after dark.
Right.
And it's only in designated areas.
Right.
When you see them by day, what they're doing is Badhai and Mangti. Now here they are playing on our superstitious fears.
Right.
Most people, when a hijra approaches them, gives money and so on, not because they are progressive or liberal or empathetic or anything, but because they think that the hijra's curse will fall on them, right? Most Indians. Or even if hijras go from door to door, ring your doorbell and want to dance or something, I think a lot of Indians respond to that because of their own, to allay their own superstitious fears. So it's not really a progressive act on the part of the public, or hijras also know this, and they're really playing on this. Because if they went there, when hijras do that, but a lot of people are offended by sometimes what they call their obscene gestures, right? In the Bombay local, for example, women are horrified if a hijra enters the ladies' compartment, and they immediately call the police. So it works both ways, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk, sir. My question is a conceptual one. If we go back to the title of your talk, which is Marginalized Within the Marginalized, it seems to suggest a model of sexual hierarchy, which one can sort of borrow from the well-known essay by Gail Rubin, Thinking Sex, where she actually produces this model of sexual hierarchy. And if you actually start looking at a lot of scholarly work on the subject, then there are several scholars who've spoken of how any kinds of forms of non-marital, non-heterosexual relatedness borrow upon the grammar of marriage itself.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering that one model is a model of sexual hierarchy. The other model is in terms of thinking of a continuum of sharedness and difference. So is it the case, in your view, is it the case that when we speak of X identities or Y identities, is it the case that we are talking of Y imaginaries of relatedness? Can we invent a different imaginary, a different grammar, social grammar, for each identity or for each sort of a model of sexual relatedness? Or are we thinking in terms of a continuum of difference and sharedness, where there is a cross-borrowing, there is a cross-referentiality, there is an inter-referencing between different forms of life and relatedness? Thank you.
I think ideally a continuum is what is desirable, because that is utopian, So ideally it should be a continuum, particularly because what you have to resist, what are you up against? You're up against the heteronormative mainstream, which also includes closeted people from within the subculture who pose as straight, right? So you're up against a big army, and therefore a coalition would help. But that is easier said than done. Eve Sedgwick says that in the 80s in America, it was almost as if feminism was the theory and lesbianism was the practice. But in the post-AIDS world, post-HIV, that fell flat. And mainstream feminists, this is what happens in India when Fire is released and so on. They distance themselves from lesbians. Again, lesbians and gay men have never been able to really come together. In India, 377 has always been a contentious issue, because lesbians would say there's not a single conviction of a lesbian under 377, because the wording of 377 refers to penetration and so on. So that has drawn a wedge, and they've never really been able to come together. There's this research article in the Baroda Journal, which Carl brings out, Forum of Contemporary Thought, by a Canadian scholar. It's called Sidewalks of Desire. And she says that she attended a queer conference in Toronto. In the evening, she says, I went to Church Street, which is the gay district. She says, I couldn't find a single lesbian bar. All the bars were gay bars. So there was no lesbian spaces. So the first part of your question was, should each identity see itself as autonomous, if I understood you correctly, and not worry about other identities? But then you would be a very small group, isn't it?
So my question was more in terms of, I'm an anthropologist by training, and my question was more in terms of that when you begin to live these relationships out, be it a live-in relationship, be it a lesbian relationship, be it a trans husband and wife, or be it the heteronormative marriage, what kinds of conversations can one create between these different forms of life from the point of view of the lived, from the point of view of the doing?
From the point of view of what?
The lived.
People who are living it.
Everyday life.
What kind of language can they create to roll?
Because often you find, and scholars have talked about it, that people who are in same-sex relationships model their relationships on the husband-wife trope.
That's true.
So that's my point.
That shouldn't happen. That's the whole point. That shouldn't happen.
People have criticized this kind of
straitjacketing.
How they are living.
See, today might...
right. How they are actually... Right.
Even in America, people say husband is so-and-so in the same-sex relationship. So unless, do you need to have different words?
I beg to differ. I think that even this issue of gay marriage divides the gay world neatly into two groups. This is where the word queer identity, because queer is about identifying a norm, okay, and then trying to disrupt it. That is queer.
We couldn't go into... Queer.
We couldn't... I certainly see myself as queer and not as gay, because queer is, and then queer doesn't subscribe to, there are other things that couldn't come up. Maybe I need to come again. We don't subscribe to the gender binary. In English, it's interesting that the third person singular pronoun is the only pronoun that gives away your gender. And therefore, there are queer people who see themselves as gender queer, who would want to be referred to in the third person, plural and not singular. So if I'm referring to Kuhu, I won't say she, I'll say they. So these are ways in which you do this. And as far as husband and wife, this is one of the most undesirable aspects of, this is what Nandini Krishnan, this is what made the trans people angry. Because, she says that many of them want cis women, not trans women. After transition, trans men want cis women partners to show that their transition is complete. So I want a full-fledged woman, And then once that happens, all the other, the paradigms of masculinity, which is, as I said, patriarchy and misogyny and all that, so the relationships then become fraught with trouble. This is her point. This is the sort of thing that because this suggests that there is no way of moving away then from these tropes that have been, that have come down, that have come down from centuries, these cultural tropes. This is very depressing that if there's no way to move away and invent your own vocabulary. Why can't gay people say we are partners? And in a relationship of two gay men, one is not necessarily only the penetrator and the other the penetrated,
of course.
right? So why using the term husband and wife, always the feminine partner would be called wife. And then everything else, do you stay at home, do you do the cooking,
But it's not just the husband and wife, it's also the butch and farm. Which is always been there. So it's not that you can get rid of this relationship with husband and wife to people in a relationship.
I think in the subculture, we say, supposing I have a partner, I would say, meet my husband, and he would also say, so we are husband and husband, not husband and wife.
Members, 1 second, if I can add something. Also, Gitika, what happens, what he has talked about at one level, yes, as a straight scholar, I find it, I might be offended by the fact that only the identity, people who are from the same identity should write, but what happened, which I realized when I was presenting a paper here, that at some level, this is true, the people who have not read the queer lives or queer languages sometimes find it difficult because in queer lives, I'm just giving that example, when I was giving presenting a paper, there was always incident that Yudi and that character, they are in love, so their relationship is very pure. Whereas, if you look at it, radical queer criticize the whole idea of love and sexuality without love. So I think within that fraction, there are queer lives. Obviously, what you talked about, there are radical queer lives which are there, which are highly, which are not invisibilized in a way, and that is the part of the radical queers to make it more conspicuous. And we use the word for that homonormativity, which means
So
you understand? So what she's saying is absolutely right in one way, because of this kind of homonormativity, that visibility is more. But that is the work of the queer, radical queers to actually puncture that idea. So of course, that's the way people are living, but there is a subculture within the queer community also. And which I realized when I was presenting paper, there was the chair who was constantly saying, there's a lot of love, and the sexuality is on account of love. Whereas, as a radical queers, that's the first idea, the sexuality can be bereft of any kind of love, any kind of anything. It could be unadulterated sexual passion. I think there are different languages within the queer
I think
community.
The moment you invoke words like husband and wife, you're subscribing to monogamy.
Right.
That's the first thing that has to be jettisoned. Not you, anybody who invokes husband and wife, not you personally, but the moment people invoke terms like husband and wife, which are actually universal terms, and we can't get away from, in India we are still not used to saying partner. But the moment you do that, you are subscribing to monogamy, which is the first thing that has to be jettisoned if you want change. Otherwise, you're just perpetuating the status quo. And the status quo is always beneficial to some and oppressive to others.
I think the conclusion is that this community has to work a lot on finding its multiple voices
Right.
before it expects anything from the larger community.